September 23, 1958, 2:47 p.m., Little Italy, Manhattan. I'm standing outside the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, and let me tell you something. This place looked like a fortress. Red brick, black awning, windows you couldn't see through. This wasn't just another Italian restaurant or coffee shop. This was the headquarters of the Genovese crime family, the most powerful mob organization in New York City, maybe in the entire country. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, I knew the club was packed. 20 made men inside, soldiers, capos, enforcers, men who'd killed for less than a disrespectful look, men who controlled unions, politicians, judges, police captains, men who moved millions of dollars through illegal gambling, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. These men were having a meeting, a very important meeting, about Harlem, about my territory, and I was about to walk in there and interrupt it. At exactly 2:47 p.m., I pushed open that front door. I watched every head turn. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Hands moved instinctively toward weapons. There I was, Bumpy Johnson, alone. No bodyguards, no weapons visible. Just me in my perfectly tailored suit, standing completely still, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light inside. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds, then chaos erupted. Someone shouted asking who let me in. Others yelled for me to get out. One voice asked if I had a death wish. But I didn't move. I stood there, calm, hands visible at my sides, making eye contact with the man at the head table, Vincent the Chin Gigante, the acting boss of the Genovese family, one of the most dangerous men in America. Gigante raised one hand. The room went silent instantly. He told them to let me talk. I stepped forward, walked through that room full of killers, and stopped directly in front of Gigante's table. I told him we needed to have a conversation about Harlem, about respect, and about what happens next. If this opening hooked you, smash that like right now, because what I'm about to tell you, what happened in the next 47 minutes, would completely reshape the criminal underworld of New York City. Let me explain why me walking into the Ravenite was absolutely insane. You need to understand the power dynamic between the Italian mob and Harlem in 1958. The Italian mafia had controlled organized crime in New York since the 1920s. 5 families: Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno. They ran everything: gambling, labor unions, construction, the docks, drugs, prostitution. If money moved illegally in New York, the mob took a cut. Harlem was different. Harlem had always been different. In the 1930s and 40s, the mob had tried to control Harlem's numbers racket. Dutch Schultz had run operations there until he got killed. Lucky Luciano had made attempts, but Harlem had always pushed back. The community didn't want white gangsters running their neighborhood. That's where I came in. By 1958, I'd spent 30 years building my empire. I controlled the numbers game in Harlem. I had protection rackets, illegal gambling houses, loan operations. But more importantly, I had something the Italian mob never could get: the complete loyalty and trust of the Harlem community. I wasn't just a criminal. I was Harlem's unofficial mayor. When someone needed help, they came to me. When the police were causing problems, I handled it. When businesses needed protection from racist landlords or corrupt officials, I stepped in. The Italian mob respected this, kind of. We'd reached an informal understanding over the years. The mob stayed out of Harlem's internal business. I didn't interfere with mob operations in the rest of Manhattan. We cooperated when it benefited both sides. But in early 1958, that understanding started breaking down. The Genovese family was expanding. They wanted more territory, more money, more control. And Vincent Gigante, the acting boss of the Genovese family, one of the most dangerous men in America. Gigante raised one hand. The room went silent instantly. He told them to let me talk. I stepped forward, walked through that room full of killers, and stopped directly in front of Gigante's table. I told him we needed to have a conversation about Harlem, about respect, and about what happens next.
I heard about it immediately. My network in Harlem was too good. I had eyes and ears everywhere. Shop owners, bartenders, street kids, police informants. When the mob made a move in my territory, I knew about it within hours. At first, I tried the diplomatic approach. I sent word through intermediaries. I made it clear that Harlem was off limits. I reminded them of our agreement. I suggested we could find other ways to work together that didn't involve them stepping on my territory. Gigante ignored me. More of his people showed up in Harlem, more pressure on my operations, more threats to business owners, more heroin flooding the streets. That's when I realized something. Gigante thought I was weak. He thought because I'd been diplomatic, because I'd tried to negotiate, that meant I was scared, that I could be pushed around, that Harlem could be taken from me without consequences. He was wrong. I started gathering intelligence. I needed to know everything about the Genovese operation. Who were Gigante's top people? Where did they operate? What were their weaknesses? What did they care about? My people worked for 3 weeks straight. We documented everything. Who was moving heroin into Harlem and where it was coming from? Which cops were on the Genovese payroll? Which politicians took their money? Which businesses were fronts for their operations? But I also learned something more important. I learned that Gigante was having internal problems. Some of the other families weren't happy with how aggressive he was being. The Gambino family, in particular, thought he was drawing too much attention. The commission, the ruling body of all 5 families, was getting nervous about federal investigations. Gigante was vulnerable. He just didn't know it yet. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to send another message through intermediaries. I wasn't going to negotiate through lawyers or mutual associates. I was going to walk into his headquarters in front of all his men and have this conversation face to face. My advisors thought I was insane. They told me the mob would kill me the second I walked through that door. They said I couldn't go in there alone, that I should take at least 10 men with me. But I understood something they didn't. Walking in there with an army would start a war. Walking in there alone would start a conversation, and I needed a conversation, not a war. Because a war with the Italian mob would destroy Harlem. It would bring federal attention. It would get people killed. It would tear apart everything I'd built. So, on September 23, 1958, I put on my best suit, left my weapons at home, and drove to Little Italy. Standing in that room, surrounded by 20 made men who could have killed me in seconds, I felt completely calm, because I'd prepared for this moment. I knew exactly what I was going to say. I knew exactly how this needed to go. Gigante stared at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A smile that said he was impressed by the audacity, but hadn't decided yet whether to respect it or punish it. He told me I had balls for walking in there like that. He told me to sit down and let him hear what I had to say. I pulled a chair and sat down across from him. Every gun in the room was pointed at me. Every eye was watching. One wrong word, and I was dead. I started by addressing him directly. I reminded him that we had an agreement. The mob would stay out of Harlem. I would stay out of their business. That agreement had worked for both of us for years. But in the last few months, he'd been breaking it. His people were in my territory. They were selling heroin. They were pressuring my operations. They were disrespecting the understanding we had.
Gigante shrugged and said business was business. Harlem had money and they wanted a piece of it. That's how this worked, according to him. I told him no, that's not how this worked, not in Harlem. I explained why, because Harlem wasn't like the rest of Manhattan. He couldn't just walk in and take over. The community wouldn't accept it. They would fight back, and when they fought back, it would bring heat, federal investigations, reporters, civil rights activists, the kind of attention none of us wanted. One of Gigante's capos, a guy named Tony Bender, laughed. He asked if I was threatening them, if I was threatening the Genovese family. I turned to him to look at him. I told him I wasn't threatening anyone. I was explaining reality. Did he think they could control Harlem the way they controlled Little Italy? They couldn't. The community trusted me. They didn't trust the mob. If they moved in by force, there would be riots. Community leaders would be calling congressmen. The FBI would be crawling all over Harlem, trying to figure out what was happening. And when the FBI showed up in Harlem, they would start looking at everything, including mob operations in the rest of the city. The room went quiet, because everyone in that room knew I was right. The mob's biggest advantage was operating in the shadows. Federal attention was the one thing they couldn't afford. Gigante leaned back in his chair. He asked what I was proposing. I laid it out for him. I was proposing we go back to the original agreement. Harlem stays independent. The mob stays out of internal Harlem business. But here's what I was offering in return. I would give them a cut of the numbers revenue, 10% off the top, every month, regular like clockwork. And I would make sure my people cooperated with theirs when it made sense. Information sharing, mutual protection. If they needed something done in Harlem, they would come to me and I would handle it. If they needed access to my networks, I would provide it. But they wouldn't operate directly in Harlem. They would work through me.
Gigante was silent for a long moment. I could see him calculating. 10% of Harlem's numbers operation was significant money, and having a reliable partner in Harlem who could handle problems without drawing attention was valuable. But it also meant accepting that he couldn't just take Harlem by force. He asked what would happen if he said no. This was the moment. This was where everything could go sideways. I leaned forward. I told him if he said no, then we would go to war, and I promised him it would be the most expensive war he'd ever fought. Not because I could beat him in a straight fight. I couldn't. He had more men, more guns, more resources. But I didn't need to beat him in a straight fight. I just needed to make Harlem too expensive for him to control. I would make sure every move he made in Harlem brought attention. I would have community leaders screaming to the press. I would have federal investigators getting anonymous tips. I would make Harlem so hot that he would wish he'd never tried to take it. And while he was dealing with that mess, the other families would start wondering why he was bringing all this heat down on everyone. Tony Bender moved toward me, but Gigante raised his hand, stopping him. Gigante asked if I would burn down my own territory just to keep them out. I told him I would do whatever it took to protect Harlem, because that's what the community expected from me. That was the responsibility I had. He saw this as just another territory to control. I saw it as home, and I would defend it with everything I had. Gigante stared at me for what felt like forever. The room was completely silent. Every person in there was waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Gigante smiled, a real smile this time. He told me he respected that. He really did. I'd walked in there with no weapons, no backup, and I'd laid it out straight. No games, no lies, just the truth about how things were going to be. That took guts. That took intelligence. That was the kind of man he could work with. He extended his hand across the table. He laid out the terms. 10% every month. I would handle Harlem. They would stay out of internal operations. But if they needed something in Harlem, I would handle it. And if there were opportunities for them to work together, they would explore them. He asked if we had a deal. I shook his hand. We had a deal. The tension in the room evaporated instantly. The guns lowered. Men started talking again. Tony Bender looked furious, but Gigante's decision was final. Gigante told me to get the hell out of his club before someone got confused and shot me anyway. He said it with a laugh. I stood up,
nodded to him, and walked out of the Ravenite Social Club. Every step toward that door, I expected to feel a bullet in my back, but nothing happened. I walked out into the sunlight, got in my car, and drove back to Harlem. The next day, word spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson had walked into mob headquarters unarmed and walked out with a deal. Not a surrender, not a submission, a partnership on his terms. The respect I gained from that moment was immeasurable, not just from the Italian mob, but from every criminal organization in New York, because I'd proven something that nobody thought was possible. A black man from Harlem could sit at the table with the most powerful mob family in America and negotiate as an equal. Over the next few months, the agreement held. I sent 10% of numbers revenue to the Genovese family every month. They stayed out of Harlem's internal business. When they needed something handled in Harlem, they came to me, and I took care of it. When I needed something from them, favors, information, protection from other threats, they provided it. But more importantly, the other 4 families took notice. Within a year, I had working relationships with the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, even the Colombo family. They all understood that Harlem was my territory, but that I was someone they could do business with. The community in Harlem never knew the details of what happened in the Ravenite that day. They just knew that suddenly the Italian mob stopped trying to move in. The heroin dealers disappeared. The pressure on local businesses stopped. Things went back to normal. But the criminal underworld knew. They knew that Bumpy Johnson had done something unprecedented. He'd walked into the lion's den and emerged not just alive, but with a deal that protected his territory and his people. Tony Bender, the capo who laughed at me in the Ravenite, tried to undermine the agreement 6 months later. He sent some of his people into Harlem anyway, thinking he could operate behind Gigante's back. I found out within 24 hours. I didn't handle it myself. I went straight to Gigante. I told him over the phone that we had a problem. Tony Bender was operating in Harlem without authorization. He was breaking our agreement. Gigante was furious, not at me, at Tony Bender. Within a week, Tony Bender disappeared. Nobody ever found his body. The message to the rest of the Genovese family was clear. The agreement with Bumpy Johnson was sacred. Anyone who violated it would answer to Gigante himself. That incident actually strengthened our relationship. Gigante respected that I'd come to him directly instead of handling it myself. I respected that he dealt with the problem decisively. Trust was built. For the next 10 years, until my death in 1968, that agreement held. Harlem remained independent. I continued protecting the community, running my operations, being the man people turned to when they needed help. And the Italian mob got their cut without the headache of trying to control a territory they never could have held anyway.
Here's what people miss about that day in the Ravenite. It wasn't about courage, although walking in there took guts. It wasn't about luck, although things could have gone sideways in 100 different ways. It was about preparation and understanding power dynamics. I'd spent weeks gathering intelligence. I knew Gigante's situation. I knew he was facing pressure from other families. I knew federal investigations were making everyone nervous. I knew that a war in Harlem would bring exactly the kind of attention the mob couldn't afford. I also understood psychology. Walking in there alone, unarmed, showed confidence. It showed I wasn't there to threaten. I was there to negotiate. If I'd brought an army, it would have been seen as aggression. If I'd sent a message through intermediaries, it would have been seen as weakness. Walking in personally, facing him directly, that was the only move that could work. And I understood what I had to offer. 10% of the numbers operation was real money. Access to Harlem's networks was valuable. The ability to handle problems in Harlem without drawing attention was worth more than they realized. I wasn't coming to them empty-handed. I was offering something they actually wanted. But I also made the cost of refusing crystal clear, not through threats, through logic. I laid out exactly what would happen if we went to war, not in dramatic terms, in practical business terms. The heat, the federal attention, the cost, the problems it would create with other families. Gigante was a businessman. He understood the math.
Taking Harlem by force would cost more than it was worth. Accepting my deal gave him revenue without the risk. That's the lesson here. Power isn't just about who can hurt who. Power is about who understands the full picture, who can see all the angles, who can offer something valuable while making the alternatives too expensive. I walked into that club knowing that if I played it right, Gigante would take the deal. Not because he was afraid of me, but because it made business sense. Because I'd structured the conversation so that the rational choice was to accept. That's strategy. That's understanding power. That's what separated me from every other street criminal of my era. For years after that, whenever young hustlers in Harlem asked me for advice, I'd tell them this story, and I'd tell them the real lesson. I would explain that you don't need to be the toughest guy in the room. You don't need to be the most violent or the most feared. You need to be the smartest. You need to understand what people want, what they fear, what makes them make decisions. You need to offer them a path that serves their interests while protecting yours. That's real power. That's how you survive in this game. The meeting in the Ravenite lasted 47 minutes. In those 47 minutes, I restructured the entire criminal landscape of New York City. I established Harlem as an independent territory. I created a partnership that would last a decade. I earned respect from people who didn't think a black man from Harlem could sit at their table. And I did it all without firing a single shot. If this story showed you a different kind of power, if you understand now why intelligence beats violence every single time, hit that like and subscribe right now. We're dropping stories like this every day, and the next one is going to blow your mind. Drop a comment and let me know, what was the smartest move I made in that meeting? Was it walking in alone? Was it the 10% offer? Or was it how I framed the cost of war? I want to hear what you think. Turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of how I stopped a race riot in Harlem in 1964 by bringing together community leaders, gang members, and police in one room for a conversation nobody thought was possible. Remember this, respect isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun. It's understanding exactly what to say, exactly when to say it, and exactly who you're saying it to. That's how you change the game. That's how you protect what's yours. That's how you build something that lasts. The Ravenite Social Club is still standing today on Mulberry Street. It's a tourist attraction now. People take pictures in front of it. They talk about the mob history, the famous gangsters who met there, the deals that were made. But very few people know about September 23, 1958. Very few people know about the day a man from Harlem walked in there alone and walked out having changed everything. Now you know. Now you understand. This is the story they don't teach in history books. This is the story of real power, real strategy, real survival in a world that was stacked against people who looked like me. I was Bumpy Johnson, and I never forgot where I came from or who I was fighting for. Every move I made, every risk I took, every deal I negotiated, it was all for Harlem, for the community that raised me, for the people who trusted me to protect them. That's what made me different. That's what made me dangerous. Not the violence, not the intimidation, the fact that I genuinely cared about something bigger than myself. And when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, when you're protecting a community that depends on you, you find strength you didn't know you had. You find courage to walk into rooms where you shouldn't survive. You find intelligence to navigate situations that seem impossible. You find ways to win when everyone says you should lose. That's the real story of Bumpy Johnson. Not just the criminal, not just the gangster, the protector, the strategist, the man who understood that real power comes from knowing when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to walk into the enemy's headquarters unarmed and demand respect. This is how legends are built. This is how history gets made, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage that changes everything. If you made it this far, you're part of something special. you understand that history isn't just about what's in the textbooks. It's about the real stories, the real people, the real moments that shaped our world. Subscribe, like, comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories matter, these lessons matter, and the legacy of people like me, people who fought for their community in ways nobody expected, that legacy needs to be told. Until next time, remember, the game is always deeper than it looks. Power is always more complex than it seems. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk through a door everyone says you shouldn't.